Live NFL trivia every Wednesday night on Twitch at 9 p.m. Eastern. Come show off your football knowledge for a chance to win cash prizes. Check the link in the description to find out more. And now, on with our feature presentation. When you really think about it, Florida State hasn't played too many schools on the West Coast. What you're watching right now is a compilation of some of the rare times they played a school from the Pac-12, as it's known today. And it's not a whole lot. Most of the meetings between Florida State and a West Coast school have come in bowl games, where they didn't really have a choice on who their opponent would be. This is UCLA in the 2006 Emerald Bowl, Oregon in the 2015 Rose Bowl during the semifinals of the inaugural college football playoff, and Arizona State in 2019 in the Tony the Tiger Sun Bowl. It makes sense why, for the most part, FSU does not play games against West Coast schools. If you're not making it a neutral site game, it's an expensive home and home if you're going to try and pull it off. And traditionally, you've already got two non-conference games against Power 5 schools in Florida and then some other school from the SEC. Plus, a cross-country trip like that could be a logistical nightmare and take a ton of planning, especially if things go haywire and you want to back out of the deal. Speaking of West Coast games involving Florida State going haywire, let's talk about Washington. Because the Seminoles have never played the Huskies before. And honestly, unless it's a bowl game where they're forced to play each other, I don't think we're ever going to see the day that these two schools meet up. There are some things that I don't think will ever happen in my lifetime. An NFL team being placed in Greenland, Montserrat, an island in the Caribbean with a population under 5,000, winning the World Cup, and Florida State playing Washington in a non-bowl game scenario. All three of these things, don't bank on them ever happening. Not after what happened between the two schools in the early 1980s, when a deal for the schools to play each other fell through, and all hell broke loose. Because this is the story behind the scheduling drama between the Florida State Seminoles and the Washington Huskies. Before I talk about the actual incident in question, we need some context to understand why the two schools wanted to play each other in the first place, as well as what the original plan for these two teams was supposed to be. Because the year is 1981, and we are just 1 year away from a battle between these two schools right here, to take place on September 11th, 1982. In one corner, you have the Florida State Seminoles, who in recent years under head coach Bobby Bowden had made themselves one of the top programs in all of college football, going an incredible 39-8 over their last 4 seasons before 1981, winning 83% of their games and making back-to-back appearances in one of the most prestigious bowl games of them all, the Orange Bowl. And in the other corner, you have the Washington Huskies, one of the best teams in the West Coast, and a team that would win the Rose Bowl during that 1981 season and would win the Pac-10 3 times in a 5-year stretch from 1977 to 81, while finishing ranked 4 times in that stretch. These were two of the top college football programs in the entire country, and they were set to square off early in the 1982 season, in a game that was sure to be seen across the country on television, even though the amount of televised games back then was awfully limited. Washington and Florida State signed a contract in 1971 to play this 1982 contest, and in 1979, everything was still good to go, as the two schools signed a more detailed contract, ironing out any loose ends. And this meant that the Seminoles-Huskies battle was on. So everything seemed to be good, right? There were no hiccups, the two schools were still scheduled to meet each other, and everything was good to go. Except as the matchup was getting closer, and as we went from the 1970s to the 1980s, something unexpected happened that had Florida State, the team responsible for making this cross-country trip, awfully concerned. And that was the fact that flying got really, really expensive. I'm not going to dive too much into the weeds of this, but in 1979, the airline industry was at a crossroads. Even though in theory, the deregulation of the airline industry from the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978 was supposed to make it significantly cheaper and easier to fly, if anything, flying got more expensive immediately afterwards because of rising labor costs by more than 10%. and because of rising fuel costs. Gasoline prices were astronomically high in 1980, jumping from 86 cents to $1.19, increasing by nearly 40%. And in the airline industry, it was even worse, as a report indicated that for United Airlines, their average price per gallon for jet fuel increased on a year-to-year basis by over 72%. So if your costs are increasing through not a lot of fault of your own, because your workers are making more money, and because fuel costs are rising at astronomical rates, how are you supposed to turn a profit, make money, and keep people flying? Well, there are two options in a crisis. Option one is that you panic, have no idea what you're doing, and just leave people stranded, a la Southwest Airlines right now. But option two, and the one that just about the entire industry did, was raise the prices to compensate, making air travel in 1980 really, really expensive. From 1979 to 80, the cost of the average airline ticket, adjusted for inflation, went up a record 38.4%, and from 1980 to 81, it skyrocketed again, going up by more than 25%. This meant that the same plane ticket that cost $76.10 in 1979, which was the average domestic airline fare, now cost $132.40 by 1981. Adjusted for inflation today, a plane ticket that cost $256 in 1979 was now $356 in 1981. For one person, a $100 price increase is a lot. Now, multiply that by an entire football team of about 100 players, plus coaches and other personnel members, and remember that it's round trip, and you can see how that would be a problem. Just in terms of flights, not even counting anything else, this trip was going to cost well into the 5 figures more than what was originally allotted for. And remember, all of those prices were for the average domestic flight. Obviously, a flight from Florida to Washington going across the country is going to have a larger price increase than that. Long story short, Florida State was screwed financially by this game now. And unlike the controversy I talked about involving UCLA and Missouri that was entirely foreseeable and felt like a cop-out, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner, this one was a very valid reason on the part of Florida State to not want to play the game anymore. It just didn't make financial sense to do it with how much the airline industry was changing in all the worst ways. Circumstances completely outside of their control happened and messed everything up. So Florida State Athletic Director C.W. Ingram, realizing that travel costs were skyrocketing at rates that no one anticipated when the deal was signed, decided in the summer of 1981 to call up Washington Athletic Director Mike Lude and asked him to cancel the game and nullify the contract. Keep in mind that Ingram was just hired as the athletic director during 1981, so he was not the AD who signed the contract for the game in 1982 to take place initially. As for Washington's response to Florida State's desire to cancel the game, absolutely positively 100% not. If Florida State were to back out now, not even a year before the game was set to take place on September 11th, 1982, we would be completely and utterly screwed. It wasn't even just that they would lose revenue from the game in terms of ticket sales and potential television rights, but trying to find another opponent to play on such short notice was going to be incredibly difficult, especially one of Florida State's caliber and recognition. Remember that non-conference games are often scheduled years and years in advance, so to schedule one not even a year out was pushing it. As Washington Athletic Director Mike Lude said on why he wasn't going to allow Florida State to back out of the contract, it borders on the impossible to schedule an opponent that's comparable with so little dead time. Most athletic directors are working beyond 1995 now for scheduling non-conference opponents. I'm certainly trying to find a suitable replacement opponent, but I've made 14 phone calls to various universities, and none of them have a date they can free up for me. Lude continued, putting the pressure on Florida State to suck it up and honor their commitment, saying, "I expect Florida State to be here. If they refuse to come, we will have litigation to go through. Florida State has the responsibility to us with a signed contract. Translation, play this game, come to Seattle, or we're going to sue. And this wasn't just an empty threat, because when Florida State unilaterally decided to cancel the game and to not play against Washington in 1982, oh man, it got ugly. The two sides tried to work something out, with Florida State submitting a counterproposal that they would play the game if Washington covered their travel costs, but Washington declined that offer. And with Florida State possibly losing money from this game if they played it, seeing as they would split the ticket revenue 50-50, and travel expenses were rising and were well over 6 figures with everything factored in, this wasn't going to happen, which left Washington really ticked off. Because 2 months after making that statement, when it was clear that this game was no longer happening, Washington filed a lawsuit against Florida State. Ken Eikenberry, the Attorney General for the state of Washington, filed a suit seeking roughly $1 million in damages, with, among other things, $350,000 in damages for loss of ticket sales, concession sales, and parking, and $400,000 for losing television coverage, a loss of exposure, a loss of prestige, a loss of recruiting opportunities, and a loss of future bowl revenue because not playing in this game could impact their national ranking. Now, if you know contract law, you know how tough speculative damages are, and while the $350,000 might not be too hard to pick up if the court finds in your favor, since those are concrete numbers that you can track pretty easily, unless you have a liquidated damages clause in there, good luck getting the $400,000. The link between this game and early season national rankings to the tune of over $400,000, especially because we have no idea how good either team would be entering the game or who would win the game, is so weak that I have no clue how Washington was even going to attempt to fight that one. Sure, the $350,000 part? If you win the case, you can probably recoup that. The game is expected to sell X amount of tickets, the average ticket at games costs X amount of dollars, and you sell X amount of concessions per game, and make X amount of dollars in parking per game. But the second part? Good luck with that. This is why you put liquidated damages clauses in there, people. This is why you put a clause in there that says in the case of a material breach, the party owes X amount of dollars. Because courts typically honor those unless they're punitive in nature. But they won't honor speculative damages most of the time, especially if they're so speculative like this one. Side note, I had some people ask me when I made my full-time announcement how as a YouTuber, I was going to use my legal education and my time in law school on this channel. Well, it's extremely helpful with stories like this. Because holy cow, I'm just shaking my head at this entire lawsuit. Alright, contract law rant aside, this lawsuit, to the surprise of no one, went absolutely nowhere. Although not for the reason that you might think. Turns out, because this was a suit between Florida State University, a public state school, and the University of Washington, also a public state school, the district court judge, Donald S. Voorhees, said that he didn't think that he had jurisdiction to rule on this case, because this was a lawsuit between two states, and he said that this should be handled by the Supreme Court. And at that point, the case got dismissed. It did not go to the Supreme Court, and that was the end of it. Florida State Athletic Director C.W. Ingram said on this whole ordeal, "I'm glad it was dismissed. They could file another case in a local court, but that's a very expensive ordeal, and I don't anticipate that they will go through with that." And he was right. That was the end of it. Although considering the fact that one school tried to sue another, it's no surprise that 40 years after the suit got dismissed in 1982, that Florida State and Washington have never played each other in a game. They've never met in a bowl game. No non-conference games were scheduled between them. Nothing. That bridge wasn't just burned. That bridge was hit with a nuke. So if for whatever reason, you've ever wondered why the Huskies and Seminoles, despite the relatively successful histories for both schools, have never met in a game before, well, now you know the answer. Or at least part of the answer. Even though Florida State and Washington had never played, there was still bad blood in this rivalry, more than 40 years later, where the only thing we have to show for it is a dismissed lawsuit. And I think it's safe to say that considering the history between the two schools, and considering this incident, that we won't be seeing these two schools playing through their own free will against each other anytime soon. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, and subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot. And be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL Trivia and win cash prizes. Link in the description below. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.